Welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by OraSure Technologies and Red Planet Substance Abuse Testing. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy-to-administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. Oral fluid-based testing products provide a simplified collection process, faster results, cost savings with minimal risk of tampering, and dramatically reduced risk of adulteration. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared, laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, and opiates. It was ranked as the #1 recognized brand name in oral fluid testing in a 2014 National Drug Testing Industry Survey. With a fast and easy-to-administer collection process, Intercept is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, and clinical screening programs, among others. Today's presentation is entitled Making a Case for Oral Fluid Drug Testing and will be presented by Bill Curran and Judy Swartley. Bill Curran is the president and founding partner of the Current Consulting Group and the publisher of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com. He is the author of 10 books on substance abuse-related issues, including the popular title, Why Drug Testing? CCG is a leading provider of drug testing policy writing services, working with companies to help them optimize their drug testing ROI. Bill is the former executive director of the American Council for Drug Education and vice president of consultant for Employee Information Services. Judy Swartley is the president of Red Planet Substance Abuse Testing, a leading provider of drug and alcohol testing services to many industries, including the construction industry. She has been involved with substance abuse testing since 2000. She also has experience as the safety director at a mid-sized contracting business, working in heavy manufacturing as the QC manager of a 4,200-person facility of Honeywell, and teaching at Lehigh University and Penn State University. It will now be our pleasure to hear from Bill Curran and Judy Swartley.
Everyone on today's webinar. I want to just first express appreciation to OraSure Technologies for hosting these monthly webinars and putting in the effort that they do to bring good, solid information to the drug testing industry and to those who use drug testing services to make sure that you have the information that you need to make good decisions. So thanks to OraSure Technologies. I would mention to you, if you're on today's webinar, you will automatically receive an invitation to next month's, the February OraSure-sponsored webinar. That will be on February 24th at 2 p.m., and that will be on drug test cheating, some of the latest methods in drug test cheating and what you can do to address those issues to make it as hard and difficult, if not impossible, for the cheaters to get away with cheating on a drug test. So that'll be February 24th, and you'll be receiving an invitation to that. Also would like to just say how excited I am to be co-presenting with Judy Swartley again. Judy and I have done a number of webinars over the years together, and I always look forward to her part of the presentation. She has a lot of, quote-unquote, real-world experience in applying lab-based oral fluid testing in the business world. And so while her bio expressed the work that she does in the construction industry, I know that Red Planet, Judy's company, provides services to all industries. And so she's got some good stuff prepared a little bit later in today's webinar. Just to get started, let me just reiterate the fact that, we can sort of, all agree that drug testing works. Back in the 1980s, when there was a lot of confusion about the drug issue, and of course we had some tragic events that occurred in the military that led to the establishment of some of the first real widespread workplace drug testing programs, the issue was still sort of out there to be decided. But we know from 30 years of experience now that drug testing works. It helps to deter drug use. It helps to identify people who need help. And it's probably the most effective sort of program or effort that that of all the things that have, the federal government's come up with, that individuals have come up with in terms of addressing the drug issue? I'm in favor of all of them. Just say no all the way to, tough love. But what has really proven to work? What do we have data that show that drug testing, that drug abuse can be deterred, it can be reduced, and it's drug testing. Now, with that in place, with that idea, committed to, it really comes down to how are you going to do your drug testing. And the truth of the matter is that there are alternatives. There are advanced testing methods in place nowadays to traditional drug testing programs. For many, many years, it's been a matter of collecting a urine specimen, sending it to a lab, and having that specimen go through a process of analysis, confirmation, verification, et cetera. And here's a little chart that sort of shows the path of the specimen from the collection up in the upper left corner of the screen down to the bottom where the result gets reported. I like this particular chart here, which my business partner, Nina French, put together, because it really illustrates not only the path and the stops that, the specimen has to make along the way, but the cost that's involved in it. And this is important. We're going to talk about the return on investment value of lab-based oral fluid testing as we get a little bit later into today's presentation. But a traditional lab-based urine test goes through these various steps, and each of these steps takes time, and time is money, of course, as the old adage goes. I'm not suggesting as part of this presentation today that lab-based oral fluid testing eliminates all of these steps and you get right to the result and it's pretty fast and it's cheap and inexpensive. That's not the message here. I think there's still value to a lot of companies in having a lab-based result. But one of the real wild cards in the entire process of a drug test is that collection that takes place at the very beginning of this route that the specimen follows. That's the wild card because a lot of things can go wrong at that point. People can cheat during that process. Collection sites may not be opened. You may not be dealing with somebody who knows how to do the paperwork, et cetera. And there's cost involved. There's cost in the actual service that's being provided, and there's cost in the time that it takes an individual to participate in the process as a donor, and also for a supervisor or manager or some other person to escort that individual to and from the collection site, especially in cases of post-accident testing or reasonable suspicion testing, where you would not want to send that individual to a collection site by themselves. So that's the purpose of this chart here. Lab-based oral fluid testing deals with a lot of these issues. When we talk about the advantages of lab-based oral fluid testing, and let me just say, I like all forms of drug testing. When drug testing is done right, it can be urine, it can be oral fluid, it can be hair, it can even be blood, which is, not really practical in a workplace setting. But all drug testing is good if it's done right. Some of the advantages that people identify with lab-based oral fluid testing is that it's not urine. And there are some companies within their corporate culture that are just opposed to collecting the urine sample. A lot of companies that like to have, certain things in place in terms of their relationship with their employees are not going to do urine testing. And others that deal with the collection sites that provide those professional services to collect a urine sample know the challenges that are involved in that. But also with lab-based oral fluid testing, it's nearly impossible to cheat. I'm going to talk about all of these things in some detail here in a minute. But you get the security and the accuracy of a lab-based result, while at the same time being able to reduce the time that it takes to actually collect the sample, which reduces the overall time that it takes to get a drug test done. And when you reduce the time, you reduce the cost of the drug test overall. Now, Jessica talked about how OraSure has been ranked as the #1 recognized brand name in oral fluid testing as part of a national survey. In the interest of full disclosure, the current consulting group has been conducting a survey of the drug testing industry every year since 1999. So in this year, 2015, we'll be conducting our 17th annual survey of the drug testing industry. And we present the results every year at the SAPA conference. In fact, this survey has become so popular that we now do an international version of the survey as well, which this year will be in its 3rd year. And if anybody on today's call is interested in getting the results of the survey, maybe participating in the survey, or being a corporate sponsor of the survey, let me know. Follow up at bill@billcurrent.com, and we'll be happy to provide some information. We ask questions about all aspects of drug testing as part of that survey. And when we asked about oral fluid testing, these are just four of the statements that were shared with us, but these were sort of indicative of what we were hearing from people. They're expecting the sale of lab-based oral fluid testing, the use of lab-based oral fluid testing to really take off once the federal government finalizes the regulations that are in process right now and lab-based oral fluid testing is added to 49 CFR Part 40. A lot of people are waiting for that to happen. But there are a lot of people who have started to sort of catch the vision of lab-based oral fluid testing. As you can see, there's this one company down here at the bottom, 830,000 tests processed in 2013, 12% were oral fluid tests. And that's mostly from one large company, but that's a lot of tests. 12% of 830,000. I had another one with an even higher amount. But there are certain advantages, as that person in the third bullet said, that are somewhat unique to oral fluid testing, but some people still want to use professional collections. I'm going to talk about how that's not necessarily required, and it's fairly easy to do a lab-based oral fluid, collection of an oral fluid sample that's going to be used in lab-based testing. We did also ask about the percentage of all drug tests that are oral fluid and the status of sales of oral fluid testing. I thought you might find this interesting. When asked, they were given these options, and so they would mark just one of these possible options. So 25.3% felt like it was 5% or less of total drug tests. 29.5% said it was between 5 and 10%, and 9.8% said it was between 10 and 15%. This may not seem like a lot on the surface, but let me tell you, I've been tracking this for 17 years now as part of our annual survey. This percentage is higher than it's ever been. If you had asked this question, or if you'd looked at the data from 5 years ago, it would have been nowhere near this much. 29.5% of industry personnel, people in the business of selling drug testing, believe that oral fluid represents between 5 and 10% of all drug tests. That's significant growth right there. And there's no other alternative testing method that really sort of has that type of growth. Between 10% and 15%, you're at about 10%. So you add the two together, you're at about 40% of people said they believe it's between 5 and 15%. That's significant. That's a lot of growth there. And in terms of sales, when asked if they considered sales to be up considerably or modestly, a combined 37% indicated that the sale of oral fluid testing is up. Now, 22.8% said it's the same. And of course, all these things are relative, right? So it depends on what they're starting from. 0 is the same as 0 if that's all you've got. But 37% indicated that the sale of lab-based oral fluid testing is up in 2014, or was up in 2014 compared to 2013. These are very strong numbers. This shows that there's growing interest in oral fluid testing, that it's translating into sales for people who are in the drug testing business, and it says that a lot of people are perhaps intrigued enough by the advantages of lab-based oral fluid testing that they're willing to look at it and, in some cases, switch their programs to oral fluid testing. But there are a lot of myths still out there surrounding oral fluid testing in general. And some of the myths that get associated with lab-based oral fluid testing are really sort of factual statements about instant oral fluid testing. I'm going to talk about the difference between lab-based and instant oral fluid testing as I go through some of these myths. Again, it's not to bring down or tear down instant oral fluid testing, but there are differences between the two. The science is different, the technology is different, the day-to-day sort of use of these different technologies is going to be different from company to company because lab-based oral fluid testing is not the same as instant oral fluid testing and vice versa. But we're going to go through some of these myths, and I'm going to go through them kind of quickly. Let me just say I put a lot of slides into this presentation. Usually to do an hour presentation, I might have about 35 or so slides. I've got a lot more than that. It's not that I'm going to spend a lot of time on each slide, but I wanted you to have this information. So if you're interested in getting a copy of these slides, let us know, or Jessica will be sending out information with how to get the slides so that you have this information, as well as all the information that's going to be packed into today's presentation. a lot of which I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time on. First, we're going to talk about accuracy. Now, I'm talking about lab-based oral fluid testing when I make this statement. And I'm going to read, I don't normally read the slides, but let me read this first part up at the top. The results of a lab-based oral fluid test may have greater relevance to understanding the effects of drug abuse and assessing an individual's behavior, job performance, and safety risk than the results of urine testing. Why is that? Well, it's because, as the underlying statement says there, the presence of drugs in oral fluid is usually related to the amount of drugs in the bloodstream at the time of the sample collection. Oral fluid, from a scientific, from a technological standpoint, mimics blood. It's an equivalent to blood. You often hear, the smartest people in the drug testing industry talking about how blood is the gold standard. But some states, by law, don't even allow blood drug testing in the workplace. They don't allow you to draw blood for drug tests. And it's impractical and it's very expensive. But oral fluid mimics blood from a scientific standpoint. It's often referred to as a blood equivalent or rendering a blood equivalent result. Oral fluid, this is very important, it tests for the parent drug, for the drug itself, as well as the metabolic breakdown of the drug or the metabolite of the drug. With urine testing, you're usually only detecting the metabolite. But with oral fluid, you can detect both the parent drug and the metabolite. That makes it possible to detect the drugs in a person's system almost immediately after the individual has ingested the drug. And the advancements in the technology of oral fluid testing, as well as in the collection technology that you see in these more sophisticated FDA-cleared collection devices, makes it possible now to more accurately quantify a drug test result from an oral fluid test. I always tell people, make sure you're dealing with a reputable provider that can provide independent empirical data to back up their accuracy claims. In other words, it can't just be marketing material from that company. It has to be independent data. It's usually going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, for example. You want to deal with an FDA-cleared device, not just for the collection device, but also for the testing system that takes place in the laboratory. I'll talk about that in a minute. You want to ask for references, right? A history of satisfied customers. But I would also suggest you do your own research. Ask for some sample product, read and study the package insert, and then put it to the test. If it really can do what the package insert says it can do, it will withstand your little pilot program. But until you actually put it to work, you're not going to know for sure if it does, okay? And if you know who you're doing business with, you're going to feel good about that process because they're going to provide that to you. There may be a charge for it. I'm not suggesting it's necessarily going to be free, but you're going to want to deal with somebody who's willing to work with you to let you find out for yourself that it works. Now, the detection times are important. I'm leading into a little discussion about the window of detection because that comes up a lot when it comes to oral fluid testing. Keep in mind, the drug transfers to oral fluid from blood. So as long as it's in the bloodstream, as long as the drug is in the bloodstream, it's going to be detectable in the oral fluid sample. And because of that, it's going to be detectable immediately after the individual uses the drug. Now, I always say virtually immediately or within, a certain time frame. But by comparison to other testing methods, the drug is going to be detectable in an oral fluid sample very, very quickly. Whereas with other testing methods, urine, you're talking about a lag time of at least an hour. And with hair testing, you're talking about a lag time of several days before, somebody who smokes a joint in the parking lot on their lunch break, before it's going to show up in a hair sample. And if you're testing them right after they come back to work because they smell of marijuana, they're acting disoriented, etc., or maybe they're even talking about the fact that they were smoking a joint out in the parking lot, it's not going to come up in a urine sample if you're testing them within an hour or so after they've used the drug. But with oral fluid, that window of detection opens up almost immediately after the individual has used the drug. And that's unique to oral fluid. You're going to be able to detect the drug within minutes, usually, of the individual using the drug because it's in their system. It's in their bloodstream, therefore it's detectable in their oral fluid sample. Now, every drug is unique, and it has its own window of detection, and as it says in number 3, each specimen type is unique, as I've explained. But the window of detection is one of the things that comes up all the time when we're talking about oral fluid testing. The truth of the matter is, because the window of detection opens up so quickly with oral fluid, you're going to get some positives on the front end of that window of detection with oral fluid that you cannot get with urine, and you certainly can't get with hair testing. Urine and hair testing have their place. I'm not suggesting they're faulty, but if you're looking for that recent use indication, say in a post-accident situation, or certainly in a reasonable suspicion situation, or maybe even as part of a random drug test, you're going to be able to detect the drugs right away. That window opens up immediately with oral fluid, whereas there's the lag time with other testing methods. Now, again, as I said, every drug has its own window of detection. Every testing method has its own window of detection. And a lot of things factor in. I'm going to show you a slide here in a minute that goes through that. The window of detection with oral fluid testing is going to close a little bit sooner than it will with urine testing. And, of course, hair testing goes out 90 days, which you may or may not want a 90-day look into somebody's life, especially if you're testing for THC and you're in one of those situations. But I love hair testing. I think hair testing has a great place in our industry. Just depends on what your objective is. But the positivity rates from the different testing methods is the telling sign. So when you're talking about window of detection and being able to detect drug use on the front end of that window of detection with oral fluid testing sooner than with urine testing, but that you're going to have some on the back end of that window of detection that you're going to detect with urine but maybe not with oral fluid testing, it impacts the positivity rate. So a study was done. You can see all the numbers down there at the bottom. I won't bore you with that right now, but look at the positivity results. The overall positivity result with the Intercept lab-based oral fluid test was 4.1% versus urinalysis at 4.4%. So urine comes out ahead. But most of that is in amphetamine, 0.17% positive for lab-based oral fluid versus 0.42% with urinalysis. And all the other drug categories, particularly in the area of THC, you see that lab-based oral fluid testing had in some cases slightly, in some cases significantly higher positivity rate. Let me focus on THC for just 1 second because I'm about to segue into marijuana. One of the myths about oral fluid testing is it can't detect marijuana. Well, that's not true generally speaking. There are a lot of factors, and I'm going to take you through that in a second. But as you see here, the positivity rate for THC was 2.5% with lab-based oral fluid testing, that middle column, and 2.3% with lab-based urine testing, the outer column on the right. So the positivity rate can actually be higher with oral fluid testing, especially lab-based oral fluid testing. When people ask me if you can detect THC or marijuana in an oral fluid sample, I always tell them yes, but you have to look at what type of testing method you're using, okay? Marijuana is detectable within an hour in an oral fluid sample, if not immediately after the individual uses it. That's why I always use that example of the person going out on their lunch break and smoking a joint, and they come back in 30 minutes later, they're going to test positive, almost 100%. But the cutoff levels that are being used in any testing method, but by comparing different oral fluid testing methods, that's huge. That will have a huge impact on the ability of that test to detect marijuana. And that's why I always make the distinction between lab-based and POCT, or instant testing. A disposable single-use device that renders an immediate result. That's an instant test device or a point-of-collection testing device. Let me just show you, because this is so important. If you're concerned about this, you need to understand there's a difference between the two. If you're not concerned about it, you're not going to care about this chart. That red vertical line there is 50 nanograms per milliliter. So, if you're looking at a cutoff level of 50 nanograms per milliliter or higher, you can see those blue bars are pretty low. Those are the positives above 50 nanograms per milliliter. To the left of that red dotted line are the positives below 50 nanograms. And you can see that the vast majority of them are all the way over to the left at 5, at 10, at 15, 20, maybe 25. The vast majority of positives for THC, 80%, are going to be well below 50 nanograms per milliliter. So when you're looking at a testing method, whether it's an instant device or a lab-based testing system, you need to ask about the cutoff level, because that is going to make a tremendous difference, especially in the area of testing for marijuana, for THC. If you're at 40 nanograms, 50 nanograms, or higher, you're going to see a reduction in THC positives. You're going to want to look for a testing system or method that has a cutoff level below 25%, or below 25 nanograms per milliliter, excuse me. And as low as possible is going to be better. And as you can see from the bar graph, the vast majority of the positives are way down there below 25 nanograms per milliliter. That makes a difference, but especially it makes a difference when it comes to THC. Now, I'm kind of breezing through these because I'm just about to get to Judy's part. Drug test cheating is a problem in our industry. If you ask anybody who deals with urine testing, for example, you're looking at a cheating method that could be as low as 2%, but as high as 10 or 20%, depending on the industry, depending on the circumstances. But drug test cheating is a problem in our industry, especially with urine testing. And again, I'm a fan of urine testing. But if you're concerned about drug test cheating, if you're concerned about people adulterating a sample, switching a sample, or doing some other thing to try to successfully mask the presence of a drug that they've used recently in a urine sample, then you may want to consider lab-based oral fluid testing, because it's difficult, very difficult, to adulterate a lab-based an oral fluid sample. And the reality is it's virtually impossible. I don't want to say impossible, because I got challenged one time in a conference on that, and as the lady explained, you know, this cheating method that had come up, I thought, I don't see how that would work. But just to account for the possibility that you have actually dealt with somebody who has somehow cheated on an oral fluid test, I'm going to say it's virtually impossible to cheat on an oral fluid test. The collection takes place within the presence of the donor and the administrator of the test 100% of the time. They're both together. Nobody goes off to a private bathroom stall and closes the door. You don't have to deal with, you know, putting blue dye in the toilet water, turning off the hot water, all those types of precautions that you would normally take in a collection of a urine sample are eliminated when it comes to oral fluid testing. Now, you can go on the internet and you can find literally hundreds of thousands. I found 1.3 million hits, websites offering advice or products to help somebody cheat on a urine drug test. But I only found a handful. I mean, consider 1.3 million. I only found a few. By few, I mean, you know, less than 6 that were offering some kind of advice or suggestions on how to cheat on an oral fluid test. And one of them was almost comical. They said, try to avoid the test. To do this, you will have to avoid submitting saliva and perform the steps requested of you by the instructor. In other words, refuse to take the test. Well, that's a violation of virtually every company drug testing policy in and of itself. That last comment's very telling at the bottom. To pass this oral fluid test, you should always know the detection time of the drug you've taken. Marijuana can be detected via saliva drug testing from an hour after ingestion up to 24 hours. I would say within minutes up to more than 24 hours, especially if you're talking about lab-based oral fluid testing, depending on the use. Between these periods of time, you must avoid being screened or you will surely test positive. The point is, if you're concerned about drug test cheating, then you may want to consider lab-based oral fluid testing. And I know that's a concern for many companies. All the steps that you go through to try to secure a collection site, all of the things you do to try to combat drug test cheating with urine add to the cost of the drug test. They infringe upon the privacy of the individual in some cases if you're talking about an observed collection of a urine sample. And it reduces your return on investment that you were thinking you were getting from drug testing, because you're adding steps into the process that add time into the process that adds dollars to the bottom line of the cost of your program. Lab-based oral fluid testing virtually eliminates all of these concerns. And there was this was actually a Department of Corrections in Iowa that switched from urine testing to oral fluid testing. Now, you're going to find these results to be obviously very, you know, what you would expect, right? They had a 5% dilute specimen rate before with urine. Of course, they switched to Intercept. It went from 5% to 0. Well, you're not collecting a urine sample, right? there's virtually no way to dilute an oral fluid sample. You're standing right in the presence of the individual who's administering the test. If you're the donor, there's no way to switch your saliva with somebody else's saliva. There's no way to add something to the saliva to dilute it or to adulterate it in any way. You're going to see that virtually go away. And I've got an example of a company's experience with that coming up here in a minute. To sort of bring us full circle on some of the myths, there is a myth when it comes to whether or not there are oral fluid testing methods that are FDA cleared. This is true with instant oral fluid testing. There are dozens of instant oral fluid testing products on the market, these disposable single-use devices. There's only one out of all of those that has FDA clearance. But with lab-based oral fluid testing, the OraSure Intercept device, as an example, has had FDA clearance for many, many years. Now, it's important that you know what FDA clearance is. And we're not talking about FDA approved. That's a completely different thing, and it doesn't apply here. FDA clearance is the term you're looking for. And essentially, it says the FDA has examined a product or a device to ensure that it is, quote unquote, substantially equivalent to other devices that are already being marketed for the same purpose. And I believe that FDA clearance is a critical thing to look for, especially if you're going to be, administering the collection yourself, if you're going to be relying on the results, making decisions about the employment of an individual or other disciplinary actions that you may take. You want the security of knowing that you're dealing with an FDA-cleared device. But let me just say this, when it comes to oral fluid testing, make sure you're looking for a device where the collection device itself has been FDA cleared and the lab testing system has been FDA cleared, that the assays that you're testing for, the individual drugs, have been FDA cleared as well as part of that testing method or system. That's critical. It can't just be the collection device. It has to be the testing system, the assays themselves. Now, in this particular case, let me give a shout out to OraSure. They're the sponsor of today's webinar, but the Intercept device is the only one that's FDA cleared for lab-based testing that includes all of these drugs here. You'll find others that include some of these drugs, but not all of them. And critical in this process, regardless of what testing product you use, whether it's OraSure or one of their competitors, you want to make sure that THC is part of the FDA clearance. That's important. Now, we did a survey years ago where we asked how important is FDA clearance to you as a drug testing provider in selling a device to one of your clients. And it was considered to be critical, essential, wouldn't do it without, et cetera, et cetera. So part of that is because you, as a provider, if you're in the drug testing business on today's webinar, you want the security of that FDA-cleared device. But if you're a buyer, if you're the end user, you're the employer or the criminal justice organization or the treatment center, you want to know that you're dealing with the best possible product, that this is a product or a device that has been cleared by the federal government. And so you want to look for that FDA clearance. It's critical to the process. Once you make the decision that these myths have sort of been satisfied in your mind, then as an employer, you're going to go through, and this could apply to a non-workplace drug testing situation as well, but you want to make sure that you do certain things to make sure that making the switch goes smoothly. And it all starts with the policy. Your policy not only has to reflect your objectives so that you're matching the drug testing methodology that you're going to use, in this case, oral fluid testing, with those objectives. In other words, you want to pick a testing method that will help you achieve your objectives. But your policy has to say that. It has to explain your oral fluid testing program, how collections will work, how results will be reported, and the compliance with the applicable state laws for the states that you do business in. And then you train your supervisors, you educate your employees, you make sure all your vendors are set up, you're dealing with a lab that can handle the volume, and you've got the collection devices on site so that you've trained your own people in how to administer that collection of the oral fluid sample, how to package it and send it to the lab for analysis. The lab will take care of the initial screen, they'll take care of the confirmation, you'll have an MRO in the process. All of the steps that you've become accustomed to with the traditional lab-based urine testing program stay in place with lab-based oral fluid testing, except you can do the collection yourself. And so you cut out that hour to 2 hours or so that it normally takes to send one of your employees to an off-site collection site, accompanied by a supervisor, mind you, so it's not just one person going, it's two people going. But instead of having two people out of work for an hour to 2 hours, you've got them off the production line, so to speak, and away from their normal jobs for about 15 minutes. And that makes a significant difference. Now, at this stage, I'd like to bring Judy in, because Judy actually has experience working with companies that have put oral fluid drug testing in place. She's got a lot of experience with companies that have switched from one testing method to lab-based oral fluid testing. And I've made presentations with Judy many times in person at conferences as well as through webinars. And some of the experiences that she's had are very applicable. It's just real-world experience that takes all of this, sort of educational approach that we've been going through for the last 30 minutes and applies it to the real world. So, Judy, let me turn some time over to you now so that you can talk a little bit about some of the experiences that you've had with lab-based oral fluid testing. And Jessica, let's make sure Judy's phone is not muted.
Okay, thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure working with Bill, who I consider the top consultant in his field, and also I'd like to thank OraSure, the manufacturer of what I consider the best lab-based saliva drug test. I have no doubt that Intercept will change the world of drug testing. The reason I believe this is because OraSure wants you to understand the product and they want to educate you on it. What differentiates them is they provide studies, data, facts, and as Bill mentioned, many of the manufacturers only provide marketing material, not studies, data, and facts. This is why you can believe in the products. And I should mention that I do sell urine drug testing. I sell hair and I sell saliva. But so whatever I talk about here is based on real-world experience. The one point I want to make is that the window of detection always comes up when I meet with people. And really, Intercept and urine are pretty much the same for every drug except marijuana. So marijuana and urine is slightly longer. It's not the 30 days that everybody thinks about. However, the one chart that Bill showed with the positivity rates, to me, is a game changer because it really changes the definition. What do you want? Do you want to use the product with the longest window of detection, which would be urine for marijuana, or do you want to use the product that detects the most positives? The window of detection doesn't come in there at all. It's really about finding all the positives. Sometimes, people will say, well, what's the most rewarding story you have? And I'll never forget, many years ago, I made a presentation to a group of contractors, and one of them decided to implement it. And a couple months later, when I followed up to see how the program was going, he told me that several of his employees thanked him for using Intercept. They had a huge problem with cheating drug tests. The employees all knew who the cheaters were, but they really didn't want to rat them out. So this was able to provide greater safety. And think about it. When your spouse goes to work in the morning, you want that spouse to come home at night. And Intercept is really the drug test that, as Bill said, is virtually impossible to adulterate. When we talk about adulteration, I just Googled it the other day, and sure enough, there are a ton of sites out there. Pass your drug test, Google that, everything comes up. What's interesting is that synthetic urine is the most popular way, and people keep it strapped to their arm or their leg because technically a collection center for urine can ask you to empty your pockets. So if they're strapped to your arms or your legs, they don't pat you down. You go into the bathroom, you empty it in the cup, and you've passed your test. So synthetic urine is really amazing. I was giving a presentation out in Portland a couple of years ago, and when I mentioned this, I heard a gasp in the audience, and the woman said, "Is that?" She was the office manager, and she'd say, "Is that what all those little plastic bottles are about?" She said, "After I go into the bathroom after a day of drug testing, all these little plastic bottles are in the trash can," and she never knew what they were for. So anyway, there's also another excellent study. In 2011, the General Accounting Office, the GAO, did an undercover study, fake driver's license, the whole bit. They looked at sites throughout the United States, and in none of those sites did the person collecting the urine find any adulterants because they were strapped to their arms, or none of the labs were able to detect an adulterant because the adulterants, the synthetic urine, is so good. The labs process it just like it's the real thing. So a lot of times I will hear comments from my customers that when they start using Intercept drug testing, obviously the quality of their employees go up because the word gets out to drug users that they shouldn't apply there. It's not a haven for drug users anymore. Comments they sometimes make is, "Oh, I forgot something in my car. I need to go out and get it," and never come back. Also, sometimes they come in, they'll see you're using Intercept, they immediately get pale. Sometimes they take the test, sometimes they leave. One time, a customer told me they left and said, "Listen, I'm not prepared for that kind of drug test." So it's really interesting. Sometimes the employees will complain about it. They'll tell you that it's not a good drug test because they want you to go back to urine drug testing where it's really easy to adulterate it. I had a company one time, they had a 1% positive with urine drug testing. And thank goodness they said they knew something was wrong. They didn't pat themselves on the back. So basically what they did was then they went to hair drug testing because, as Bill mentioned, it has a 90-day window of detection. Their positive rate went from 1 to 20%. It went up to 20%. So, yes, they had a problem. The issues, though, with hair drug testing are that it's expensive. It's a little, you have to train somebody and that type of thing. So they decided that they were going to have a dual program. They were going to do some hair testing, but now the primary product they use is Intercept because it can't be adulterated, and it was still producing a very high positive rate for this company. So, and then once they weeded out all the drug users, they're now back to about the national positive rate. So they went from a really high rate down to an average rate. The other thing I do want to point out is that sometimes it takes a long time. You might implement an Intercept program and not see a positive for a while. This has happened more than once. It creates doubt. But I will tell you the statistics prove it out because I see marijuana positives come across my desk all the time. So, Bill, I will hand it back to you, and we can go from there.
Thank you, Judy. Now, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
I know you've been doing this a long time, and as you said at the very beginning, as a drug testing professional, you offer urine testing, hair testing, and oral fluid testing. And, obviously that's a smart business thing to do. And as you talked about some companies that have switched from urine testing to oral fluid testing, if you had to narrow it down to just two things, what would be the two most important reasons why, or most common reasons, if you will, why people switch to lab-based oral fluid testing?
Sure. The number one, it comes up all the time, is that it saves time. They can get the workers back on the manufacturing line. They can get the workers back on the construction site. They can get nurses back on the job. it takes 15 minutes altogether. The test itself only takes 5 minutes, and then filling out the paperwork, whatever, compared to a urine test that can take over an hour if they're sent out to a facility. They never mention the cost savings. They always talk about the time. Now, obviously, time is money, so they will save money on that. The second is no adulteration, no shy bladder. They can do the test and be assured that it's going to produce the right results.
Now, do you typically find that from a professional standpoint that potential users of any testing method, understand the cost involved in the time that it takes to do a drug test, or are they primarily just looking at the sort of the hard dollars, the cost of the test itself? And if so, how do you deal with that?
Well, a lot of times, especially if they're just not convinced about Intercept because of the rumors that you mentioned earlier in the presentation, they do challenge me on the cost. Now, typically, Intercept is less expensive, but in some remote parts of the country, it might not be. It might be about the same. I've rarely found it to be more expensive. But when they challenge me on that, the challenge for me is to make them understand the downtime of the employee, because that's the soft cost. Nobody charts it, but the average urine test, and studies have shown this, take at least an hour. So that's an hour of productivity. And for construction sites, if they are late on the job, if they are late by one day, it can cost them tens of thousands of dollars. So the fact that they can get people back on the job immediately is a huge benefit.
Yeah, I remember making a presentation at a construction safety conference and talking about that very issue, about the time away from work that would be required with different testing methods. And I asked the audience, from their experience, what would they say is the average time that it takes to do a urine collection? And this one woman who owned a construction company raised her hand. She said it takes 2 to 3 hours. And I said, well, I can see that happening, but it shouldn't take that long. But she said what was happening is that they would go, and while they're away from work, they just stop at a bar or a pub and have a couple of beers while they're, off the clock, so to speak, except they're not really off the clock, right? And so she found that if she could pull the drug test in-house and do those collections, internally, that she not only didn't have them away from work for, 2 or 3 hours, but that, she didn't have, people working in the afternoon, with the buzz going.
That is so true. At the minimum, they're going to stop for a cup of coffee on the way back to the office. And, oh, by the way, I took a wrong turn, so that's why it took me longer to get back to work.
Yeah. You also mentioned earlier, though, with urine testing, there's a term that we hear a lot, which is called shy bladder, somebody who has a problem. And sometimes there's a legitimate medical explanation for somebody who cannot provide or void a urine sample. But, how often do you hear of people dealing with some type of dry mouth syndrome where they can't produce an oral fluid sample?
Well, that's one of the advantages of Intercept, is that it actually has a saline solution on the pad. Now, I don't mind it, but, sometimes after the drug test, the administrator might have a basket of lifesavers there or whatever. But that guarantees that enough saliva gets on the pad. So I have never, ever in all these years, 15 years, had a company call me and say, hey, there wasn't enough saliva on that pad. Do I still have to pay for that test? That's what it usually leads to. But, yeah, I have never had that.
So the shy bladder issue obviously goes away. We're not dealing with urine, but you've really never run into a situation where somebody can't produce an oral fluid sample.
Correct. Now, I will say this. Sometimes the people that don't want to come up positive, they try to move that pad into the hollow of their mouth so it won't get saliva on there. However, the wand has a flag on it, and the person administering the test can absolutely see that that pad is placed properly in the mouth, so you don't get that situation where it doesn't have enough saliva on it.
Okay. Also, maybe just, again, from sort of the real-world perspective, you could speak to this issue. I know in some workplaces, perhaps, regardless of the industry, but maybe where there's, sort of a unionized setting, they may be concerned about, on behalf of their union members, okay, so it's a legitimate concern, but they may be concerned about, a company using a drug test unfairly to discriminate against somebody, or to maybe even go so far as to switch a sample to, to make somebody look bad that, they want to get rid of. It doesn't seem like that's even possible with oral fluid, because the donor and the administrator are always right there in front of each other.
Exactly. Well, I have several companies using that have union employees, and the initial meeting usually goes where I explain the product. The union hall wants to see all the brochures with the data and facts, studies, of which OraSure has plenty. I give that to them, and I have never had a situation where the union has put it down and said, no, you can't use this. It's the brochure, the information, the studies, the data, and the stacks that OraSure has on this product are just totally over the top.
Okay, thank you. Now, let me say to our audience that if you have questions that we can't get to today, because we are running short on time here, address it to me, address it to Judy. We will be happy to, respond by email so that you get answers to your questions. And one of the questions that often comes up is, and this is one of the typical myths of oral fluid testing, is that, quote unquote, I thought it was illegal to do oral fluid testing, which is kind of comical on the surface. But there are 3 states that do not permit oral fluid testing: Vermont, Maine, and Hawaii. And as I was explaining to somebody the other day, it's not that they prohibit oral fluid testing overtly. It's just that they restrict drug testing primarily to urine testing, and I think in one case they allow hair testing. So it's not as if there are 3 states that have studied the issue and decided we're not going to allow oral fluid testing. It's just that in many cases these state laws were written so long ago that they haven't gotten around to changing the language since sort of the advent of the technology of lab-based oral fluid testing. But those are the only 3 states that I would say don't allow oral fluid testing. The other 47 you're good in. There are a few states with what we would call voluntary drug testing laws, where you voluntarily participate in a program, and if you do so, a drug testing program that is, and if you do so, you qualify for some benefit that the state's offering. Like here in Florida where I live, the state offers a 5% workers' comp premium discount if you participate in the state drug testing program and drug test according to their regulations. They're voluntary, but they apply to only the companies participating in that voluntary program. Here in Florida, outside of that voluntary program, you're free to test any way you want to. And I only bring that up because there are a few of these voluntary state laws that restrict drug testing to urine. They don't allow point-of-collection urine testing. It's lab-based testing, and that's usually because they sort of punt on the issue of the regulations, or the procedures, I should say, of how the drug test can be administered, and so they simply defer to the federal regulations, to 49 CFR Part 40, which right now does not permit any other testing method except lab-based urine testing. However, if you're in the drug testing business, you know this, of course. They're in the process. The federal government is in the process now of developing regulations that will allow employers who are federally mandated to do drug testing to have as an option lab-based oral fluid testing. Not hair testing at this time, and not point of collection or instant urine or instant oral fluid testing, simply lab-based oral fluid testing. That is in process. It's going to happen. It's guaranteed to happen. It hasn't happened yet. It may be sometime before those regulations are finalized. But when that happens, some of these states that sort of punt on the issue of procedures and defer simply to 49 CFR Part 40 or to the DOT regulations, it depends on the language that they use, would de facto permit the use of lab-based oral fluid testing. A state like Ohio has a voluntary law that sort of punts on the issue and defers to Part 40. That state would then allow lab-based oral fluid testing once those regulations go into place. So I just wanted to clarify that. We didn't include slides on that for today's presentation, but I wanted to make sure that our audience knew that. We do have a lot more information in the slide deck. I'm sharing my screen with you, so I don't have the ability, the way this particular program is set up, to go, leap ahead 10 slides. So you're going to see as I scan through some slides I'm not going to talk about. This next set of slides are very interesting. I'm not going to spend any time on them today, but it's one company's story, a grocery store chain here in the Southeast that converted from lab-based urine to lab-based oral fluid testing, and some of the results that they had and the cost savings that they experienced, the positivity rates, et cetera. You'll find all of that very interesting once you get these slides and you have an opportunity to go through them. We also talk about some of the companies or industries that are more likely to have an interest in lab-based oral fluid testing, and these are some of the industries. Judy has a lot of experience not only with construction but with the healthcare industry and hospitality, et cetera, in helping companies convert to lab-based oral fluid testing. And there's a lot more information in there. And this next set of slides, I'm also not going to take the time to go through because we're just a few minutes away from being complete, and we don't want to. We understand your time is important and it's precious, and so we don't want to overstay our welcome. But I have a whole set of slides in here on the issue of return on investment, and I'm just going to put one of them up here to show you. This is an example of the cost of a drug test in one method versus, and this would be lab-based urine testing compared to lab-based oral fluid testing. The only thing I want to point out right now, and let me activate the pointer here, is right here. With lab-based urine testing, you're going to have the cost of an off-site collection or professional collector that you have to include, and that's always there. And the cost could range from somewhat low to a lot higher than $15, of course. And these are just arbitrary numbers. We put them in there. They're not intended to say this is the average across the country or anything like that. In fact, Judy and I have spent a lot of time talking about that, and I left these numbers in the way they are. But as you go through it later when you're looking at the slide deck, please be aware and remember that these were just placeholder numbers so that we could demonstrate. You could increase the cost of the collection to $25, and you could increase the cost of your oral fluid test from $25 to $30 or whatever you want to make it so that the numbers work for you. But you can see right here that if you train your employees to actually administer that oral fluid collection, the cost of the collector goes away, as well as the cost that it takes for somebody to be away from work at their hourly rate. I put a worker in here at $10.10 and a supervisor at $25 an hour. I didn't even put anything in there for the fringe rate, right? Which may not necessarily apply to a part-time worker making $10 an hour, but it probably does apply to that supervisor making $24 or more an hour. So you can add about 40% typically for fringe rate. It might be a little less, but usually on average it's about 40%. The point being that there's a cost involved in that individual being away from the workplace while they're participating in the drug test. And again, I don't want to focus on the numbers that I used as much as sort of the process of understanding that there is a cost involved and you have to take that into consideration. We're at the end of today's presentation, and we do have some questions here, some of which I've sort of filtered in my discussion with Judy, others that we're not going to be able to get to today because we've run out of time. But you're going to get an email from Jessica, and she's going to explain that in a minute, just in a few seconds, where she's going to send you information on how to access the recording of today's presentation, as well as the slides that go along with it. But before I turn the mic back over to Jessica, let me once again say thank you to OraSure for hosting these monthly webinars and providing this information at no cost to those who would like to take the time to be on these webinars. And especially thank Judy Swartley, my good friend, for participating in today's webinar, for the information that she's provided. I appreciate the kind things that she said about me earlier, but she is really, through the experience that she has dealing with this, really an expert when it comes to offering her clients solutions that match up against their needs. And as one provider, she has found that lab-based oral fluid testing works in many instances with the clients that she deals with. So Judy, thank you again for your participation in today's webinar.
You bet.
And Jessica, with that, I will turn the microphone back over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill, and of course, thank you, Judy. On behalf of OraSure Technologies, we hope that you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.